they're off in their assumption, their conclusion might tend to be a little off. That all said, it did not stop John King, CNN anchor John King, reporter, not a talk show host, not a commentator, Crane Durham style, from saying this the other night. Roll it.
Out with new numbers, it says, yes, Obamacare is expensive, but less expensive than they thought, by about $104 billion over 10 years. That's a decent chunk of change. We know after the disastrous rollout, they got the enrollment numbers up, above 7 million, plus Medicaid. Where is the Democratic super PAC to run this message you see on this screen, to say, hey, Republicans were wrong. We got the enrollment up. It's not as expensive as we thought. Why won't Democrats, Jonathan, decide in this tough environment the only way to change it is to go on offense?
Answered that same question now for a few weeks, and I think it's because they'd rather still change the subject. Now, when does that fact change itself?
Republicans won't let them change the subject. The Republican super PACs, conservative super PACs are running ads essentially saying the bad weather is Obamacare's fault. The traffic jam is Obamacare's fault.
Sending mailers to women in particular, to young people who could benefit from the healthcare law. So not sort of the wide-ranging, statewide ads on healthcare, but more targeted outreach to people who might find the law more popular.
Hard to do in such a loud environment, but against it.
One fast note, independents, the polling is still pretty rough there on the ad. I think Democrats are watching that.
The question is, can you try to change it? And if you don't try to change it, you won't change it.
New York Times Jonathan Martin and Associated Press White House reporter Julie Pace. No, that wasn't a strategy session for the Democratic Party.
Oh, there's so much there you could say. Let's begin with this. He questions why Democrats are not going on the offense. Probably because they don't have to when they have cheerleaders doing it for them for free.
Bravo.
Number two, he said it's less expensive. It's $104 billion over 10 years. Even if you buy that number, do the math. $104 billion over 10 years is not a good chunk of change, as Mr. King describes it. Saying that it's less expensive and not as bad as people thought is like, it would be the same thing as saying it doesn't stink, it just doesn't smell as bad.
And this goes to a classic clip of Newt Gingrich in the debate of 2012, the presidential debates. And he made this statement. Roll it.
I just want to raise, since we spent this much time on these issues, I just want to raise a point about the news media bias. You don't hear the opposite question asked. Should the Catholic Church be forced to close its adoption services in Massachusetts because it won't accept gay couples, which is exactly what the state has done? Should the Catholic Church be driven out of providing charitable services in the District of Columbia because it won't give in to secular bigotry? Should the Catholic Church find itself discriminated against by the Obama administration on key delivery of services because of the bias and the bigotry of the administration? The bigotry question goes both ways, and there's a lot more anti-Christian bigotry today than there is concern on the other side, and none of it gets covered by the news media. I just want to raise some.
I don't mind hearing that again. I could hear that all day. Is he right, Chris Woodward?
Sure. And certainly, you know, I mean, we could do a year's worth of Beat the Press segments and talk about all the things that weren't covered, or maybe weren't covered in the ways that they should have been, you know, just with this and this avenue and that thing explored. You know, Charlie Butts, he works 40 hours a day, 9 days a week, trying to cover a lot of the stuff that oftentimes never goes reported. If it was not for Charlie and a lot of people, Ben Johnson certainly, a lot of people wouldn't have any clue who Kermit Gosnell was, or they wouldn't have any idea things like the Hobby Lobby case. And it's not just with Catholics; it's certainly with the evangelicals. There's a lot of Protestants out there, Baptists, what have you, that are being persecuted for their beliefs as well.
An anti-Christian bias. That's what we are seeing, and that's what we address. And you just referenced one of the reasons why people tune in, lock it in, and it's important. Oftentimes when we have the programming that we do, it's from a Christian worldview. When we look at the mainstream media, we see lying by omission. We also see the fact that you'll have strategy sessions on how the left, the Democratic Party, can win. And how you ask a question. Oh, very important. What did you think of the census and the changing of how they're going to measure because of the changing the phrasing of the question regarding the measure of the uninsured?
You know, it's it's not surprising, and certainly we've seen a lot of changes and different presentations with a lot of reports these days. You know, Dan Celia has been he's been on the horn really, or on the microphone, I guess, talking about changes in the way that GDP and things like that are calculated. It's across multiple avenues, and really, you know, it's not surprising when you have an administration that has claimed it has 7 million plus enrollees. We still don't know how many of those, concrete evidence I'm talking about, we still don't know how many of those people have paid versus enrolled. We don't know whether they were previously uninsured or just getting a new plan. Those are big questions that need to be answered. And quite frankly, a lot of people are not posing those questions. And you can say, well, why aren't you doing it? You know, I'm trying to do it with various people that, you know, have inside knowledge and whatever else. And you know, let's just put it this way. The White House doesn't return my phone calls. Jay Carney and I are not exactly simpatico.
That speaks to another problem altogether, which is access to those in power and the willingness for them to engage. I find it sad and deeply troubling that when the commander-in-chief, our president, gets a tough interview, it's considered an interview that was rude and disrespectful. Brett Baer, I'm referring to. I don't have a problem with a reporter challenging the president. Let him finish the answer, sure, but don't run out the clock. I remember Matt Lauer did that with President Bush, and I thought President Bush handled himself quite well.
But Matt Lauer has no problem, you know, grilling Bill O'Reilly over a book about killing Jesus.
No, and again, there's the double standard. We want some consistency. We're not getting it, and it does have an impact. If somebody breaks the law, changes the law, or changes numbers, and it is not reported, then we have a America that's not informed, doesn't know what they're truly voting on, and it could have disastrous consequences. That all said, Cheryl Atkinson, a reporter for CBS News, recently resigned from the organization. Here she is talking about Fast and Furious and other scandals that she has covered. Roll it.
I don't think on the viewer's part, but on the people that decide what stories go into the broadcast and what there's room for, they felt fairly early on that this story was over when I felt as though we had barely begun to scratch the surface. They didn't ask me what was left to report. I was asked by CBS to look into Obamacare, and it had a similar trajectory. Just before Christmas came word that the top security official, the computer security person, who still works there at HHS, had refused to sign off and recommended, in fact, that this website not go live because of all the security issues. And that was not considered a big enough story, I suppose, is the way to put it, by those who decide what goes on the air. But I thought it was hugely important.
So you have Fast and Furious, Obamacare, not being followed up on. And that's coming from the news organization.
Right. You know, it's, you can, certainly somebody could say, well, it's just, it's ideologies that are influencing those at the top, and therefore they're saying yes and no to these kinds of stories. It shouldn't be about your ideology. It should be about what the viewer, in this case, the CBS viewer, just viewers in general, need to know. I mean, we do news from a Christian perspective, and oftentimes we'll try, and not necessarily with every story. Certainly, I covered, you know, general consumer stories, but I bring up Charlie and Chad, Rush Jones, those guys. They have done stories that kind of narrow it down to what the Christian listener and OneNewsNow.com reader need to know about these kinds of things. You know, the interesting thing with the reporter there, CBS, I remember somebody at MRC had mentioned not long after Benghazi, they actually praised her for her work, saying that she was really the only network reporter that was really covering it and spending a lot of time doing that. That was something that should have been seen as a credit to CBS. And unfortunately, those at the top who she says were saying yes and no to stories didn't see it that way.
And then we have a book coming out talking about the administration, the Obama administration, and the treatment of the press. Roll it.
What are the forces of obstruction and intimidation?
I think any journalist who's been covering Washington for a few years would agree, and they've agreed in letters written to the White House and in recognition given to the White House over its unprecedented secrecy and lack of FOIA responses and so on, that there is pressure coming to bear on journalists for just doing their job in ways that have never come to bear before. Now, there have always been tensions. There have always been calls from the White House under any administration, I assume, when they don't like a particular story. But it's particularly aggressive under the Obama administration, and I think it's a campaign that's very well organized, that's designed to have sort of a chilling effect, and to some degree has been somewhat successful in getting broadcast producers who don't really want to deal with the headache of it. Why put on these controversial stories that we're going to have to fight people on when we can fill the broadcast with other perfectly decent stories that don't ruffle the same feathers?
Chris Woodward, closing moments. This is not business as usual.
No, it is not. And certainly, could we say it's happened in other administrations? Absolutely. But we see it time and time again with this particular administration. That's why the White House had private meetings with liberal journalists.
Chris Woodward, what's your Twitter, real quick?
At AFNC Woodward. At AFNC Woodward.
Happy Easter, buddy.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Arnold Allard on Ukraine. What is the truth? AFR Talk.
American